Difficulty in video games seems to be a new common thread, and a lot of developers seem to be backing away from the casualization of games. In a more personal note, I think the Souls franchise might be the culprit for this NES Renaissance. Hello folks, on this video I want to talk about the Soulsborne series and how they made me reunite with my gamer roots. Now first I'd like to give you guys a little bit of background. My name is Cheps, and I am a gamer, and as far back as I can remember, I have always been a gamer. One of my first memories is from when I was 4 and my grandfather gifted me my NES. Now my parents have told me that I used to spend hours upon hours glued to that thing, playing the original Super Mario until I got good enough to finish the damn game at 4 years old. Now, I wear this as a badge of honor because I was a gamer before I could speak correctly, and my attachment to gaming only grew as I became older. Way back then, games did not have the technological capacity to get much depth concerning story, and most of the games that did, like Final Fantasy, were written around it, leaving much to be desired in regards to gameplay. A good exception to this rule is Ninja Gaiden, a game that focused very heavily on both its gameplay and story. Yet, it's a game that, if you do not die, you can complete the whole game quite fast. I have a very personal metric that I use to judge the elements of a game, and in that metric, I think that there's 4 elements that conform the core of a game: gameplay, story, graphics, and sound. As I talked about before, games of that period tended not to devote too many resources to the story, as the storage capacity was very low during the 8-bit era. Now, there were of course some exceptions in that era, but they were certainly in the least, and they did not have the capacity to reach a level of depth in storytelling that we give for granted to games nowadays. So we have 3 other areas in which those old games could focus on. The next area is sound. Now, in this area I believe those old games excelled. No, I'm not saying that they had the symphony or an orchestra displaying these beautiful tracks, but one could just spend 10 minutes listening to the music library created by Koji Kondo, back then in-house music composer for Nintendo, to realize that some of the most iconic pieces of game music can be attributed to this man's work during this era, and it certainly influenced other later game music composers. The Mario theme, Zelda theme, Punch-Out!, these are all now legendary tracks. So I think that they should be applauded for doing as much as they did with as little resources as they had available at the time. Now the third gaming element that I mentioned are graphics. And game developers were certainly fighting against this factor whenever they were creating games back then. I believe that this element includes not only the specific sprites utilized and the resolution, or lack thereof, that this system managed to display. I think that one of the most important things is the ability to switch between the images, which is what we call refresh rate, and even though games from that era were able to run at 60 frames per second, they would tend to get very glitchy whenever some of the refresh cycles would happen, which is how we ended up with games that were littered with bugs and were very glitchy. And the fact that they could not release a patch after they released a game back then made this element painfully obvious to this day. However, just like with sound, I happen to admire the amount of creativity that this element extracted from developers, as again they had to do a lot with just a little. Now the final piece of the puzzle is the element where I think the NES games arguably excelled at: gameplay. Now, I believe that the limitations of the system, not only due to storage and RAM, but also the inclusion of only 2 play buttons and a simple gamepad, forced developers to focus greatly on mechanics that might be very fun. I think that this is why this was the era of the platformer. Timing your jumps, running, just having one button for an attack, gave us such classics as Ninja Gaiden, Mario, and also other action games like Metroid, Castlevania, Battletoads. The library of such games is actually quite large for that era. Another thing that these games had in common is the fact that they tended to be very hard games. I think that this is due to the fact that these games tended to be very short if you did not die. Now think about it. Would you be happy buying a $60 game that you could finish in 2 hours? So way back then, the difficulty was a need for developers, and the focus on the skill of the player was almost ubiquitous back then. Now this was my playground, and this is where I grew up in, and to be honest, I really excelled at these games way back then. You can ask any other gamer that grew up with the NES how you needed to get very comfortable with being very precise with the controls because the inputs were not as sensitive as they are right now. However, as time passed, I noticed that games started to become increasingly easier to finish, and especially when we got to the 3D era. Now, I happen to think that this had to do more with the ability for developers to be able to essentially tell more detailed stories, and of course the storage capacity of the cartridges allowed for several hours of cinematics and gameplay to be packed into just one game. So games no longer had this need for them to be super difficult in order for them to be worth that $60 price. Of course, the advent of 3D games also allowed for developers to present a more cinematic experience. Games like Metal Gear Solid and Silent Hill proved the capacity of this new 3D game world to provide a rich and cinematic storytelling experience. So developers started looking at games more like an interactive movie and less like the games of old. I think this trend only got exacerbated by the advent of the QuickTime gameplay events. Now, historically, these were first pioneered by interactive movie laserdiscs in the mid-80s, which allowed developers to show vivid graphics on par with the cartoons of that era. However, the gameplay was nigh inexistent. Arguably, the game that greatly popularized this feature was Resident Evil 4, which pioneered the use of this element during both cutscenes and select moments of gameplay. And although a lot of games have used this element ever since, I think the ultimate culmination of this has been the Uncharted franchise, which has made heavy use of QuickTime events and very rigidly scripted progression. Now, back to my personal story. I was a gamer all throughout my teen years and most of my 20s. However, I eventually got married and had some kids, and to be honest, I just didn't have the time to be a gamer anymore. So yeah, I became one of those rare beings that get exposed to the light and actually have a life. So I was no longer a gamer. Now, all jokes aside, there was a good 3 to 4 year period where I did not really play many games. And it is during this time that Dark Souls grew in popularity without me really paying much attention to it. Now, after I became a casual gamer, I really could not find any games that caught my fancy. Yeah, I played some games every now and again, and even being a very passionate Zelda fan, the newest one from that era, Skyward Sword, it really didn't do much for me. This all continued pretty much until I played Bloodborne. Now, it took quite a while for me to get out of my casual state and actually start enjoying the game, but once I really understood its mechanics, I was hooked. Not only on Bloodborne, but the whole Dark Souls series as well. But why did the Soulsborne series succeed where Skyrim, Skyward Sword, and others failed? Sure, I finished all of those games, but how much of an achievement is that in an era where the developers really expect a high percentage of gamers to finish their games? I think that the main reason the Souls series succeeded in drawing out the gamer in me, and arguably in a myriad of other people, is because the gameplay is essentially structured like an old NES game. Now wait, before you dislike the video or call me a moron, hear me out. Now, I know that this is not going to apply to everyone, but any one of you who have the ability to use a cheat engine to play Dark Souls and engage the infinite health cheat will agree with me that once you do this, the game can be rushed through in a matter of a couple of hours. Yes, provided you know where you're going, and essentially all the enjoyment has gone out the window. Now if you ask me, this is because the Souls games tend to be on the short end when you compare them to other contemporary games. Yet, it is very interesting to find that these games enjoy a very lasting and steady fandom. As a matter of fact, one can still go onto Dark Souls 1 in any of its many consoles, and you will find a community that's still bustling and full of invasions and co-op. Of course, it will not be nearly as populous as how it was near release, but it is certainly not bad for an almost 6-year-old game. Now, if we analyze our 4 core elements, which are, again, gameplay, graphics, sound, and story, we will notice a very interesting thing. Regarding sound in the Soulsborne games, the sound effects are okay, to be honest, nothing to really write home about. However, the music only appears in boss battles in very specific areas of the game, like in Firelink Shrine or Guinevere's Chamber. What this achieves is a very distinct feeling when one reaches one of these locations, marking these as prime spots in the game and cementing them into our memory. If on top of that you add to the fact that a lot of these tracks are absolutely gorgeous, and one can easily see why they are favored by a lot of gamers. Now let's move on to the graphics of these games. Now, on this area, to be honest, even though I love the series, I have always been a little bit underwhelmed by the graphics. I think they just look a little bit dated if you compare them to some of the other games in the same era. However, I really have never been a graphics kind of guy, so I'm not too nudged by this. However, the design of the enemies and the beautiful settings, they do help a lot. Even though the overuse of recycled assets does leave a lot to be desired. Now we have reached the 2 elements that I find most interesting in this game, and arguably these are the ones that got me hooked into the franchise: story and gameplay. First off, the story. This one hurt me so bad the first time I played Bloodborne, as I had never really played a game that was so focused on detail, all the while not spelling out the story clearly. This in turn, at least on my first gameplay, gave me the feeling of, okay, cool enemies, but there really is no story. In reality, the story and the lore of these games is one of the most engrossing aspects of the game, and if you see my channel, most of the videos that are worth anything, to be honest, are lore videos. Now, Miyazaki himself has discussed on why this stylistic decision was made in regard to the story. Now, when he was growing up, Miyazaki would read stories, but he really didn't read as well as he would have liked. So it resulted in him only half understanding the story and having to fill up the rest with his imagination, which is essentially what he asks of us in these games. Now, on some of our cases, we were too dense to figure this out on our first gameplay, and it is not until we watched our patron saint VodiVidia when we realized, oh, so that's what that means. Once you know what you're looking for, the story of these games slowly starts opening up to you, and the speculation aspect of this game is what keeps me coming back for more. If you think about it, in older NES games, the stories in a lot of these games were found implicitly through the gameplay, which made the player immerse in the experience, like Metroid, for example. So, on this overlaying point, I come to the last element, and arguably the most important one: gameplay. Remember how before I mentioned this game was like NES games in the gameplay? Well, what I mean here is that this game relies heavily on its difficulty. and not its length to make it worth its $60. Now, the difficulty in this game comes from 3 basic mechanics: high damaging enemies, accountability for your actions, and pattern recognition. In these games, the enemies do a lot of damage, which results in the player having to play very carefully, or just risk dying every 2 seconds, and having your own little version of the Groundhog Day, repeating the same level again and again and again. Yet, if you ask most of the proponents of this game, they will swear by this damage, pointing at this and the second mechanic, accountability for your actions, as some of the reasons Souls fighting mechanics are so tasty. On Souls games, there are no interrupts or cancels to your action. Now, if you have ever played a hack and slash like Devil May Cry, you know exactly how important this is, as one can cover for mistakes with quick reflexes, and in turn just chain attacks together with more reckless abandon. Dark Souls does not allow for this, as every attack that you do will not be able to be interrupted, and will finish its complete animation unless you are interrupted by an enemy attack. Now, this is huge, as the combination of this mechanic with the damage, and also the stamina bar, makes correctly planning your attacks a crucial skill. If you add the fact that enemies have predictable patterns, then you have a recipe for a game which greatly rewards memorizing its inner mechanics. That is where the mantra of "get good" comes from. Yet, that was also the mantra for "get good" in the era of the NES, where randomness was relatively tame compared to some of the casual fests we have nowadays. Now, I think this is how the series made me a gamer again. And I think this is what happened to a lot of people. By exposing me to an updated version of the mechanics I grew up with the NES, the Souls franchise made me a gamer again. And I am glad to say that, judging by the reaction people has had to this series, new gamers are ready for this kind of challenge. Following this, I severely hope that game developers follow suit and just bring back the challenge in video games. Because I have to say, at least to me, all of these games, vast as an ocean but deep as a puddle, are far too easy, and there's only challenge in finding everything the game has to offer, or finding the fun in the game, well, at least for me. So kudos for the developers going back full circle and actually trying to make games and telling the story through gameplay, not just their little circle jerk of artists shoving all of their deep plot points down our throats with hour-long cinematics, all the while cutting gameplay in half. Hey, Hideo? Either way, you guys let me know what you think. Again, if I'm saying something stupid, just tell me in one of the comments of the videos, and if enough people prove me wrong, I will have to just make another video and retract. Also, let me know, what game made you into a gamer? As always guys, if you like my video, it would help me if you gave me a like. And if you like my content, just consider subscribing to the channel. Also, let me know if you like these opinion pieces, and I will keep doing more. And if you don't like them, let me know as well, so that I can stop. You guys have a wonderful day. This is Cheps. I'll be seeing you soon.